Mary sings. If you're ever out on a Sunday and want to catch the sermon, you can find them on youtube.com. Or if you ever want to let somebody know about our church, maybe let them know what a service is like, you can recommend them to youtube.com. All right, this morning the message, the text for our message is from the book of Titus. So I'm going to give you a moment to find that. We're going to read 3 verses from the book of Titus, chapter 2. Now, Titus is one of those little books that's hard to find. So it's okay if you need to look in your table of contents. You may feel about Titus. It just takes up 2 pages and just very brief. You may feel like one little boy said about the book of Obadiah when he started looking for it in the Old Testament and couldn't find it. And he finally gave up in a huff and said if God had wanted us to read that book, he wouldn't have hidden it. And Titus is a tiny one like that. But keep looking. If you come across 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, keep going. If you come to Philemon, Hebrews, and James, you've gone too far. Go back. Titus, we're going to read chapter 2, verses 3 through 5. And the title of the message today is How to Be a Godly Mother in an Ungodly World. Now, Paul is writing to Titus, a pastor, and he says this: Likewise, teach the older women to be reverent in the way they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but teach what is good. Then they can train the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, and to be subject to their husbands, so that no one will malign the word of God. Today is the 99th Mother's Day here in America. The first Mother's Day was May 9th, 1914. So next year we'll have the 100th celebration of Mother's Day. Mother's Day, motherhood rather, is no easy job. Not that I've been a mom, but I've observed it firsthand. And I think today probably harder than ever for this reason, that the tasks of motherhood are the same, the fundamentals, but society has changed. And so much, culture has changed so much. We now live in a time where most people have elevated personal happiness to being the very highest goal of humanity. And when you live in a culture like that, when you're raising children in a culture like that, where personal fulfillment is all most people care about, it's very difficult to raise your children where you teach them, for example, the value of hard work, or self-sacrifice, or to do things for the common good of all. It's very difficult to teach those to children when they live in a world where most people are just thinking about themselves. But you keep doing it, you keep working hard as a mother, because you know that motherhood is about that. It's not just about nurturing, but it's about training your children and raising children into adulthood. Now, Titus was a pastor. He was one of Paul's helpers, going back to Paul's first, and probably converted on Paul's first missionary journey. He was the pastor of a church that would have been in a city much like ours, Los Angeles, a pagan city. The people in his church, they came from that background. They were saved out of that background. And so those people knew very much what it was like to live in an ungodly world. The mothers in that church were trying to raise their children in an ungodly world. And so Paul gives Titus some advice to pass along to the women. And there are 2 things I want to point out to you today. Here's the first one. The first thing that Paul tells Titus to teach the mothers in the church is to develop Christian character. I'll use that as sort of a summary for 7 brief points that Paul actually makes. Verse 3 and verse 5, develop Christian character. He says, first of all, in verse 3, that the women are to watch their conduct. Be reverent in behavior is how the New International Version translates that. The King James says that they be in behavior as becometh holiness. I like the New Living Translation on that. It says older women should live in a way that is appropriate for someone serving the Lord. Now, Paul calls them And so we ask the question, well, how old is an older woman? And very wisely, Paul doesn't say. He doesn't get into that. One of our friends, we were missionaries with in Argentina, he was saying that once he and his wife were watching a movie, and his wife pointed out an actress on the screen, and she said to him, "Do I look older than her?" And he hesitated in answering. And he said she got really mad. And by the way, men, if your wife ever asks you a question that begins with the words, "Do I look older than?" the answer is always no. No. So Paul doesn't tell us how old an older woman is, but for our purposes today, let's just assume that older means old enough to be a mom, and old enough to be perhaps even a grandma. And so he says that the women, here's the point of it, about this being reverent in behavior. Think of it like this. Paul is saying, conduct yourself in a way that is in keeping with being a Christian. You know, even lost people know how Christians are supposed to behave. We certainly know how Christians are supposed to behave. And that's what Paul is reminding us of here. Don't be like the world. Be like the church of Jesus Christ. Behave in a way that is in keeping with that. And then he says in verse 3, watch your tongue. Don't be a slanderer, is how the NIV translates that. The King James says, not false accusers. I came across this quote this week because it's interesting that Paul would address this comment to the women about the use of language. I came across this quote, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought it made sense. Someone wrote, just as men are more inclined to abuse others physically, women are more inclined to abuse others verbally. What do you think? It's probably true, huh? I think that's a good insight, and evidently Paul had that insight too. And realizing that the verbal destruction can often be even more damaging because, you know, most wounds you can heal from, you know, the cut, the you know, whatever, but the verbal wounds to the psyche, to the emotions may last a lifetime. And so Paul warns of this behavior. By the way, this word that is translated slanderers, I don't like the King James translation. They're false accusers. I think the New International Version gets it exactly right when it says slanderers. The word comes from a Greek word that is closely related to the Greek word for devil, diabolos, very similar to the Spanish word diabolos. And it comes from two words that means to throw in between. To throw in between. And that's what the devil does, doesn't he? He throws in between our relationships. He throws lies in between relationships. He throws dissension. He throws discord, disharmony. In the Garden of Eden, that's what Satan did with Adam and Eve. He threw mistrust in between their relationship, deceit in between the relationship, and created a breach between not only Adam and Eve, but between the two of them in God. And so keep that in mind with your relationships, that Satan is constantly trying to throw something in between the two of you. And so here Paul uses this as a reminder to say that the things that we say not be allowed to be that which comes in between us. Then the third thing he says, also in verse 3, is to be sober. He says, not a slave to much wine. And enslaved, of course, it means to bring into bondage. It emphasizes a permanent condition of being controlled by wine. And think about it, or any drink. If you've ever been around somebody who's drunk, it's not attractive, is it? And so Paul is giving this as a reminder that as a Christian, to watch your conduct, that it not bring damage to your reputation or cause others to follow your example. And then we jump over to verse 5 now. We're going to come back to verse 4 later. But verse 5, the fourth thing he says is that the women are to be self-controlled. The King James says discreet. New International, rather the New American Standard says sensible. New Living Translation says live wisely. What it means is to have a sense of what is appropriate for you as a Christian. That's what live sensibly means there. To have a sense of what is appropriate. People used to wear these bracelets and they had the letters on it, WWJD. Do you remember those? What would Jesus do? I actually like that. And that's a good question for us to be asking ourselves from time to time. What would Jesus do in this situation? Because right thinking leads to right living. Our outlook determines our outcome. And if we're not thinking properly, we're not going to live properly. R.C. Sproul, who is a Reformed commentator, said this of this verse, and I like what he says. A self-controlled woman is in command of her mind and her body. She has control of what she thinks about and what she does. She does not allow the foolishness of others to distract her. She does not become involved in things that are immoral, unspiritual, or foolish. She knows what her priorities are, and she is devoted to them. That's a good summary of what be self-controlled means. And then the fifth point, also in verse 5, he says, be pure. King James says, be chaste. Pure here refers to moral purity. There is a sense in which dress is a part of this, but it's not just dress, it's manner of conduct. Paul is saying not to do anything, say anything, or dress in any way that would be considered inappropriate. And moms, this is such an important thing to pass along to your children, and especially to your daughters, about the appropriate ways to behave in the world. One of the things that has changed so much in my lifetime is not so much how men behave. I look around and men pretty much behave the way they've always behaved, which is not good, but it hasn't changed. But you know what has changed a lot is the way women behave. And here's a good point that Paul is driving home. Teach your daughters and your granddaughters the proper way to behave, the proper way to talk. When I was a boy, I heard men curse all the time. I never heard women curse. I hear it all the time now. Teach women the proper way, your daughters and granddaughters, how to dress, how to talk, how to act. And then verse 5 to 6 point, he says, be workers at home. King James says, keepers at home. And this is a little more difficult to translate, but Paul's idea here is that the wife or the mom is to be busy at home, or to be devoted to the home, or as we might say today, a homemaker. Now, Paul isn't saying here that a woman can't work outside the home. The idea is that she is caring for her home, whether she works outside the home or not. That the home should take a position of priority in her life. And I want to underscore this as much as I can. I hope you hear me say this. Christian homes do not just happen. They are created. You will not have a Christian home just by chance or by accident. If you want a Christian home, you must create it. And your home must be a priority. And there is no greater responsibility and no greater privilege in life than being a mother in a Christian home and making a home. I came across this survey, and this I thought was interesting. It's from 2010. Over 80% of women in America between the ages of 25 and 24 work outside the home. Now, that's not the part that surprised me so much. What surprised me in this survey was conducted by Family Circle magazine. What surprised me is that 70% of the women who work outside the home in that age bracket, 25 to 54, 70% of them say they would stay home full-time if they could do it economically. So there is that desire there, which is still present, and I think is a good thing, to make home a priority. And so if you're in a situation where economically you just can't be at home full-time, at least don't lose the sense of priority over the home, and make sure that you devote yourself to that. And then the seventh point on this about developing Christian character is also in verse 5, and it is to be kind. The King James says good there. Kindness and goodness are actually both a part of this. What the word literally means is to be good-natured or kind-hearted. It refers to that which is good in its character and beneficial in its effect. You might be surprised that this is the exact word. Do you remember the parable of the soils that Jesus told about the man who goes out and he spreads seed, and some of it falls into bad soil and it doesn't produce anything, but some of it falls into good soil and it produces plants that grow and are healthy? This is the exact word here. And so he's saying that this is to be the essence of your character, that it is good, that it is giving, that it is productive. And this type of goodness, this type of kindness, is characteristic of moms, isn't it? I'm not saying that every single mom who's ever lived has been like this, but I think it's much more characteristic of moms than it might tend to be of, say, dads, just in general. Mothers are known for being self-sacrificing and giving up so that their children can have things. I love the story of a little boy who was in class, and the teacher was trying to teach the class about fractions. And she asked this little boy, she said, "Now, Johnny, if your mom baked a pie, and let's say you have 6 people in your family, and your mom cut it up so that each of you got a piece, what percentage of that pie would you get if there were 6 of you?" And he said, 1/5. And she said, "No, now listen again. There are 6 of you, and your mom bakes a pie, and she cuts it up so that each of you get a piece. What percentage would you get?" And he said, 1/5. And she said, "Johnny, I'm afraid you don't understand fractions." And he said, "I'm afraid you don't understand my mother." She'd say she didn't want it, so that the rest of us could have some. And you know, that's just the story, but it's how moms tend to be. And that's a wonderful thing about motherhood. And so there, that part of the sermon, moms, about your example, about your conduct, develop Christian character. I love this little 4-line poem. It says, "I do not ask for mighty words to leave them all impressed, but grant my life may ring so true, my family will be blessed." And then the next point in verse 4, Paul says, love your children. Now he also says, love your husbands there, and that was originally to be part of the sermon, but the sermon just got way too long. But let me just say one little word about that, about love your husband. If you are married, that husband-wife relationship is to be the centerpiece of the home. In other words, your home needs to be adult-focused, not child-focused. This is one mistake that I see, especially younger parents making today. Their entire the focus of the home becomes on the children. I heard one mother saying recently about her 10-year-old son, "He's my rock." And I thought to myself, gee, that poor kid. And poor her, because no 10-year-old is ready to be some adult's rock. You're supposed to be his rock. He's supposed to lean on you, not the other way around. So that husband-wife relationship needs to be the foundation. But moving on to love your children, let me tell you 3 ways to love your children. Loving your children does not mean you give them everything they want so that they can keep up with all their friends, have all the latest gadgets, all the right clothing and all that. Number 1, loving your children means that you care for their emotional, physical, and spiritual needs. All 3. When Paul wrote to young Timothy, who was also a pastor, he writes this to him. He mentions his mom and his grandma. Listen to what he says to Timothy. He says, "I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother, Lois, and in your mother, Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well." Moms, grandmoms, spiritually speaking, you cannot pass on to your children what you do not possess. You have to be close to the Lord if you want them to be. You have to be right with God if you want them to be. And so loving your children means that you care for their spiritual, physical, and emotional needs. Number 2, loving your children means that you discipline them. I'm convinced 80% of the kids in this country have never heard the word no, at least not out of their parents' mouths. The book of Proverbs says, "Do not withhold discipline from a child. Punish him with the rod and save his soul from death." Now let me say this. When I was growing up, I think a lot of the punishment I got probably would be called child abuse today. So I am not advocating that you abuse your children. But I think we've gone to the other extreme today, where there's just no discipline in the home. There are no consequences to anything. I hear, I see moms in the store pushing their little 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds around, and they say, Johnny, stop talking. Shut up, Mom. And Mom says, okay. We've gone to the other extreme now, where kids are running the show. I heard about a missionary who went to a church and he was speaking, and he was trying to raise missionary awareness and maybe trying to see if there was anybody in the congregation who felt called to be a missionary. And at the end, when the invitation was given, this one lady came down the aisle. She wanted to say that she felt God had impressed upon her the call to be a missionary. Now this woman, her teenage boys were known as the worst behaved children in the church. They were just holy terrors. And so when she stood before the church and said, I think God is calling me to be a missionary, one fellow leaned over and whispered to his wife, yeah, and pointed to her boys and said, and there's the little heathens he wants her to preach to. Look, it's got to start in the home, right? It's got to start in the home, and discipline is a part of that. And so number one on loving your children means that you take care of their emotional, physical, and spiritual needs. Number two, it means that you discipline them. And number three, it requires that you teach them. Loving your children also includes instruction. Parents, you are your child's first teacher. I came across some humorous things on the internet this week. One fellow said, my mom was always teaching me about religion. She'd always say things like, you better pray that comes out of the carpet. Or she was always teaching us about genetics, saying things like, you're just like your father. Or she'd teach us about the weather, saying, it looks like a tornado swept through your room. But seriously, moms, you are your child's first teacher. And what an awesome blessing and responsibility that is. Make sure you teach your children right from wrong, for example. Make sure when your kids grow into adulthood, they know right from wrong. Teach them to be considerate of others. Oh my goodness, have we lost that today? Especially among the young, that they have no consideration for others or respect for others. Teach your children the value of hard work and of self-sacrifice. Teach your children what the important things in life really are. It's not how fancy your car is, how much money you've got in your bank account. Teach them what really matters in life. And try to instill in your children a Christian worldview. You can't make them Christians. They have to decide that on their own. But at least make sure they understand what the Christian worldview is. And we try to instill this in our 3 children. I always thought of child rearing as laying a foundation. You have them in your home for, let's say, 18 years. Maybe beyond that emotionally and all that, but let's say about that. That's when they'll sort of check out and they're on their own then, emotionally and intellectually and all that. But you have 18 years to lay a foundation. Now later on, they're going to build a house on that foundation, and you will not build that house for them. They will build that on their own. But the foundation they build it on, you poured that. And how good or how bad that foundation is, that's on us. What kind of house they build on it, that's on them. But the foundation, that's ours. And so make sure that you lay a foundation that when they do begin to build a house on it, it's a foundation that's going to stand. And so there's Paul's second point. Mothers, love your husbands, love your children. I came across this little paragraph. I love this. It says, the ministry of being a mom is one of the toughest assignments God ever gave anybody. She's got to be as insightful as a psychologist, as tough as a Marine Corps drill instructor, and as gentle as a nurse. She's got to be a labor negotiator, a teacher, an electrician, a plumber, and a carpenter. It requires an endless supply of energy, a massive amount of patience, an iron will, and recognition of the fact that if she ever gets sick, she's got to be well before the end of the school day. Now, that's the bad news. The good news, moms, is that you hold a place in your child's heart that no one will ever rival. It always strikes me when I'm watching football and they go to the sidelines and show the players sitting there on the bench, and when they realize the camera's on them, what do they all say? Hi, Mom. Now what strikes me about that is that it's 99.9% certain that the dad taught him how to play football, but he's saying hi to Mom. Or you'll hear these little black box things if an airplane goes down and the pilot realizes they're about to crash. They always say the same thing. Mom, I love you. And then boom. That's because mothers hold a place in a child's heart that no one else does. And that never changes. And that's the blessing and gift that God gives to you. And so moms, how to be a godly mother in an ungodly world. Watch your conduct, develop Christian character, love your husbands, and love your children by taking care of their emotional, physical, and spiritual needs through discipline and through instruction. This morning we're going to sing as our song of invitation that favorite song of mothers everywhere, Jesus Loves Me.